Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC in New York City. As you probably already know, today we're going to be talking about one of the most popular options for nationals of Canada or Mexico to come to the United States to work for an employer in the United States. Specifically the TN visa. We'll talk about the requirements for the TN, some particularly challenging categories, and some other aspects of the application process. I will try to answer all of the questions. I encourage all of you to please send in your questions. I may save those till the end, but I do plan to get through all of them. So to send in any questions, please use either the chat function on Zoom or the Q&A function on Zoom. And I'll be monitoring both throughout the presentation. Um, a few housekeeping items before we get started. We try to do several webinars a week, and these run the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. So our firm does handle family immigration. We handle green card applications, temporary visas like the TN, the E2, the F1, the H1B. All of these options our firm handles. And we try to put together webinars that we think will be most helpful to our prospective clients. So, of course, all of those are completely free, as is this one. So we do hope that you'll join us for any future webinars that might be helpful to you. We record our webinars as well. So this webinar is being recorded. We post those recordings to our YouTube channel. So please check out our YouTube channel when you get a chance. It has not only the full-length webinars, but also shorter videos. And again, those run the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. So we hope those are helpful to you. After this presentation, we'll send you an email where you can find a link to our YouTube channel, a link to our website, as well as a very helpful and comprehensive guide on the TN visa that we hope will be helpful to you. If you have questions about your specific circumstances, whether you qualify for a TN or another visa, how to navigate a visa like the TN while also being interested in a green card, questions like that, please do schedule a consultation with our firm. It's very easy to do that. You can just visit our website. We have a link where you can choose a time that works best for you, as well as the attorney you'd like to speak with. And we'd be happy to speak with you during a consultation. All right, without further ado, I will go ahead and get started by talking about the TN visa requirements. So again, the TN visa is available only to nationals of Canada and Mexico, and that's because the TN is rooted in NAFTA. Um, so to qualify for a TN visa, the first requirement, a threshold requirement, is you must have a passport from Canada or Mexico. You don't need to have been born in these countries, but you do need to hold a passport from one of those two countries. So, for example, if you were born in India and you naturalized and became a citizen of Canada and you have a Canadian passport, that's perfectly fine. You can apply with your Canadian passport. Second of all, the profession that you're coming to the United States to perform needs to be listed in the TN regulations. Now, that might sound complicated, but it's really not. If you're at your computer right now, I'd encourage you to Google NAFTA, NAFTA, TN regulations. And one of the first links that should come up is a link to the actual NAFTA regulations. It's 8 CFR section 214.6. And when you look at those regulations, you will actually see a list of occupations. So it starts with accountant and then architect, computer systems analyst. We go on to economists, engineers, there are veterinarians, dentists, all sorts of occupations. There are dozens. So you need to be coming to the US to perform one of these occupations. If you're coming to the US to perform a job that's not on this list, you are very likely going to have a hard time getting a TN. The exception is, and we'll talk more about this, is if you can fit your job duties within the management consulting category in a legitimate and honest way, or if you can you realize that your job duties, even though they are under a certain job title, say at the US employer, that the job duties actually line up with one of these occupational categories. And we'll talk more about that over the course of this presentation. So your profession must appear on the list of professions provided in the TN regulations. The third requirement, you must have the required qualifications to practice that profession. And usually this is education or experience. So if we go back to the regulations, again, how do you know what the qualification is? It's not the qualification of the US employer. The US employer might want to see that you have a PhD. A PhD is never required for a TN. So to figure out what the requirement is, go back to the regulations, find your occupation. So let's say you're coming to the US as an accountant. You need either a baccalaureate degree, a licenciatura degree, or a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. So those are professional licenses for accountants. That's accountant. If you're coming to the US as an economist, you need either a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So there is no professional license that can qualify you as an economist as there is for an accountant. If you're coming to the US as a management consultant, you qualify by either having a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or the equivalent professional experience. So a management consultant, we'll talk about this more a bit later in the presentation, you can qualify without a degree. So you can qualify based on experience, equivalent professional experience as established by a statement or professional credential attesting to 5 years experience as a management consultant or 5 years experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So that's the management consultant. So you see how we have different requirements depending on the occupations. Economists, it's a bachelor's degree. Accountants, it's a bachelor's degree or a professional license. For management consultants, it's a bachelor's degree or experience. Some categories are a post-secondary degree or diploma or certificate and experience. So you really need to look at the specific category and make sure that you qualify. That again is a threshold requirement. If you're applying as an economist, for example, and you don't have a bachelor's degree, then you simply are not going to qualify for that on a TN, and you need to find another visa option. So the fourth requirement, you must have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the United States. So basically what this means is the TN is not a visa that's intended to allow you to come to the US and find a job. You really do need to have that offer lined up, and that employer is going to actually sign a letter describing the role, describing why you are the ideal fit for the role and you're qualified based on the TN qualifications. And you'll bring that letter signed by the US employer with you to the border to apply or to the consulate to apply for the TN visa. So you do actually need a job offer before you apply for the TN. And finally, in the job that you're coming to the US to fill, you must be employed to engage in professional activities consistent with the listed profession. So what does that mean? That means if you are coming to the US as an accountant, say, you can't just work in marketing, say, help them with their social media accounts, because that's not what an accountant does. You actually need to do what the government thinks that an accountant does. So how do you figure out what the government thinks an accountant does, or any of these professional categories? How do you know what the government thinks any of these TN categories does? The answer is the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So for any of these occupations, you can go to Google and Google OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, and then the name of the job. So I just did this putting in OOH accountant. OOH, by the way, the Occupational Outlook Handbook is a publication of the U.S. Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a very extensive and helpful resource. The OOH not only talks about what people typically do in jobs, it also talks about what they're generally paid, what their qualifications usually are. So it can be a very helpful resource. For the TN, the main way it's helpful is that it defines what they do. So if you Google OOH accountant, and then you click the second tab on your screen that says what they do. You'll see what accountants and auditors do. And this, again, is just an example for accountants. So accountants examine financial statements, compute taxes owed, inspect account books, they organize financial records, they assess financial operations, et cetera, et cetera. So you actually have a quite detailed list of job duties for what people do as accountants. So you want to make sure, bringing it back to the bullet, the fifth and final bullet you see on your screen, you want to make sure that you're coming to the US to perform job duties for your occupation that are consistent with those that are in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. Because when you arrive at the border or when you arrive at the consulate and you say to them, I'm coming to the US to work as an accountant on a TN visa, they are going to have in mind the Occupational Outlook Handbook job duties. And they're going to say, okay, tell me what you're going to do in this role. And if you start saying things that are not consistent with the Occupational Outlook Handbook, they're going to say that's not what an accountant does. And you're looking at a likely denial. So you want to make sure the job duties don't have to be verbatim, of course, but aligned. They need to be consistent with those in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And of course, as the assumption I'm making is that this is an honest representation. You do actually, of course, need to be doing those job duties when you get to the US. One of the most common questions we get is, does the TN visa require sponsorship by the employer? And to answer this question, it's important to first define what sponsorship means. Sponsorship has a fairly clear meaning in US immigration law. It is what people have in mind when they're talking about the H-1B or an employment-based green card. So what is that? Sponsorship is basically when an employer is saying, I support this person for, say, a green card or for something like an H-1B. The regulations that come with those visa and green card options are significant. So for example, the H-1B and the employment-based green card generally require that the employer test the US labor market. They need to advertise the job, see if there is a qualified and available US worker before they take someone on an H-1B or the green card. That process can take months. They need to promise that they'll pay a prevailing wage, which is generally above the minimum wage. They need to basically promise that they'll employ the worker, that they won't what's called bench the worker. They won't bring them to the US and then not give them work. So they need to generally also promise that if the job is terminated, that they'll pay for the travel for the person to return to their home country. None of those requirements apply to a TN visa. And for that reason, we say that the TN visa does not require sponsorship. All the TN visa requires by the employer, by the US employer, is that the employer provide a job offer. So they say, yes, if you get a TN, we will employ you in the US. And that they sign a letter that basically explains who they are as the employer, their need for someone in this role, and how you as the applicant are qualified to fill that role. The letter should also say how much you're going to be paid, how much they anticipate paying you, and for how long they're requesting TN status. But those things are not binding. You would be, generally speaking, an at-will employee. So if what the employer letter would usually say is, we plan to employ this individual for, say, 3 years. We plan to pay them $80,000 a year, but that doesn't mean they have to employ you for 3 years at $80,000 a year. You're an at-will employee. So if it just doesn't work out, they do have the ability to fire you generally. And if you decide to quit, you generally have that ability as well. So you see how the TN employer really has few, if any, obligations to you and to the government, as they would say in an H-1B context or a employment-based green card context. Now, we do, with some frequency, have conversations with employers who would like more information on this. So if you are talking with a US employer and they really don't seem to understand this, we are very happy to speak with the employer directly for our clients if that's our client's preference. Um, Filing for a TN at a port of entry or a consulate. So this is a distinction, and I'll actually bring in the final bullet, filing for a TN from within the United States. The reason this is on this slide is because what I described before, where the only thing the employer needs to do is sign that offer letter, essentially, um, that is if the person is applying at a port of entry or at a consulate. If the applicant is inside the US and applying for a change of status to TN, then the application process is that the employer would file a form I-129 with USCIS, asking USCIS to change the worker's status to TN status. That that is largely a procedural difference. The employer is signing the I-129. However, it does not create additional responsibilities beyond what I described before. The difference is that it is an application that is tied to the employer. If it is denied, it is the employer's denial. It is not the employee's denial, as it would be if the employee were applying at a port of entry or a consulate, where that would be the employee's denials because the employee is applying there, not the employer. So I that that point is a nice segue to this slide because who can apply at a port of entry or a consulate versus USCIS? So this comes down to your nationality. Canadians have all application options on the table. Canadians can apply if they're inside the US, they can apply to change their status through USCIS. They can apply at a consulate for a TN visa, or they can apply at a port of entry. So that could be a land crossing, that could be an airport. But Canadians really can apply at any of those options. Where do they usually apply? Canadians usually apply at a port of entry. The reason for that is consulates tend to take a little while. They usually have a backlog, whereas a port of entry is instant. You walk up, you have a conversation. If you're approved, you get the stamp in your passport, and you enter and you start working in your new job. It's also cheap to apply at a port of entry compared to a consulate, and especially USCIS. So USCIS, just to give an example, if you file the I-129 without premium processing, you're likely looking at a few months before you'll get a decision. And if you pay for premium processing, you'll get a decision within 15 business days, but that is going to cost you about $2,800 for that expedite fee. I'm not remembering the exact dollar amount, but it's about $2,800 for that expedite. So you can see why it's just nice to show up at an airport or a land crossing and apply for the TN there, pay a very low fee. Typically, I believe it's somewhere around $55 to pay for that application at the border, and you have an instant decision. So what about nationals of Mexico? The difference for nationals of Mexico is that they cannot apply at a port of entry. So they cannot apply at a land crossing and they cannot apply at an airport, for example. They must apply for the TN if they're outside the US at a consulate. If they are inside the US, just like Canadians, they can apply at USCIS. So that process is exactly the same, regardless of whether the applicant is Canadian or Mexican. If they're inside the US, the process is the same. The employer would file the I-129 form for them. So Mexicans outside the US must go to the consulate. To do that, they would file a DS-160, which is an online application, goes to the consulate, and then the consulate will review the DS-160, and when they're ready to call the person in for an interview, typically send an email and bring the person in for an interview. And then assuming the interview goes well, they'll issue the visa in the passport, and then the applicant will be able to come in to the US. So a little more involved, certainly more involved than a port of entry, but usually consulates are not too delayed. These days they were 2-3 years ago certainly delayed, but now they're getting up to speed. So what we usually see is that it's not especially burdensome to apply at a consulate. Now, nationals of Mexico do have the benefit of being able to apply for a 4-year TN visa. So Canadians can only get 3 years on a TN. So nationals of Mexico can get 4 years if they pay an additional fee. So that's oftentimes a very good deal. And regardless of whether, excuse me, you are Canadian or Mexican, each time you enter the US, you are usually given 3 years in TN status. So that's an important distinction. So if you're a national of Mexico, you can be granted a visa for 4 years, but each time you enter the US, you get an I-94 each time you enter, and that I-94 will usually have 3 years of TN status maximum. So, and also for nationals of Mexico, in certain cases, they will, for renewals, the renewal can be done by mail. So the consulate will make that decision after you submit the DS-160. They may reach out to you and say, you actually don't need to come in for an interview. Go ahead and mail in your materials, your passport, and we will give you the visa. That does need to be done from within Mexico. So don't mail your passport from the US. You need to be in Mexico to do that. Excuse me. So let's switch gears and talk about some particularly tricky TN categories. So if you remember, if we visit the TN regulations once again, there are dozens of TN occupations, as I've said, going from accountant all the way. Let's see what's Z. Well, we have veterinarian. That's good. Zoologist. All right. So accountant to zoologist. Some of those categories are more difficult than others. And two of the especially challenging categories are management consultant and economist. And those are challenging for very different reasons. Management consultant, that category is difficult in general because it is one of the few categories that does not require a degree. So the government knows if someone is applying for a TN visa and they don't have a bachelor's degree or higher, then they are going to fall by and large into the management consulting category, regardless of whether they're actually going to work as a management consultant. And so they scrutinize that category. Let me quickly say, though, that there is a spectrum between a safe TN application and a risky, a safe TN management consultant application and a risky TN management consultant application. A safe TN management consultant application is if you are coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. Those applications tend not to be risky. It's fairly clear you are going to be working as a management consultant. And so, of course, you would need to qualify either by having a bachelor's degree or experience as a management consultant. But assuming you have that experience, working for a management consulting firm in the US is usually not difficult. Where this category does get challenging is if you're coming to work for an employer in the US that is not a management consulting firm. So I like to use the same example related to a case that I handled that I think illustrates this pretty well. So let's assume that someone is an expert in solar panels. They are a national of Mexico, and they've been working for a decade in the design and manufacturing of solar panels in Mexico. And they get a job offer from a company in the US that manufactures solar panels. And so they will be coming to the US to advise that US company on how to improve its manufacturing process. Let's assume the US employer has a fairly specific challenge that it just costs too much for them to manufacture solar panels. So they want to bring in this outside consultant from Mexico to help them figure out how to address this problem. That would be a risky application. Risky, but certainly still viable. It can certainly be approved if it's framed the right way, because that person would be working arguably as a management consultant. So again, we would go to OOH, and we do always have to make sure that the person is going to be performing job duties that are aligned with the TN category. So if we look for management consultant, they're called management analysts on OOH. What they do, they gather and organize information about the problems to be solved or the procedures to be improved. They interview personnel, conduct on-site observations. They analyze data. They develop solutions. They recommend new systems or procedures. They make recommendations to management and confer with managers. So the example I gave checks all of those boxes. So this person is going to collect data, figure out what the problem addressing the US employer is, and make recommendations to management. It is risky, though, because the US employer is not a management consulting firm. So how do we strengthen that application? The way to do that is to make sure that the employment relationship looks like what the government expects a consulting arrangement to look like. So let me give some specific examples. When a company in the US hires a consultant like someone from Bain or BCG or McKinsey, that company generally does not put that consultant on their payroll as a full-time W-2 employee. Instead, that consultant is usually hired, or the firm is hired, the consulting firm is hired, say, as a 1099 independent contractor. They are going to be paid based on some pretty discrete, well-defined deliverables. So let's say months 1 to 3, the consultant is going to do A and going to analyze this specific aspect of the problem. Months, say 3 to 6, they are going to develop recommendations, and months 6 to 12, they are going to actually help implement those recommendations and monitor them. And they'll be paid based on those deliverables. That looks like that's much closer to what the government expects a consulting agreement to look like. So if in our example, the US employer were looking to employ this person as a full-time W-2 employee, that would be a problem. That would very likely be a problem because it looks like an employment relationship, an employee-employer relationship, rather than a consultant arrangement, an independent contractor arrangement. So it's good to have a consulting agreement in place. It's good to have the compensation paid based on deliverables, and for those deliverables to be very well defined, for example, in the consulting agreement. The word that the government uses here is that the consulting position, must be supernumerary. That basically means an extra role that's beyond the typical roles at the company. So again, the person cannot be filling a full-time role at the company. So that's really how you want to think about management consulting roles, again, where the US employer is not a management consulting firm. You want to make sure it really does look like that traditional consulting arrangement rather than an employer-employee arrangement. So economists, this is also a very challenging category, but for completely different reasons. The reason why the economist category is tricky is that a policy memo that was issued by the government in November 2017 specifically said, excuse me, that economists do not include those who are working as financial analysts or market research analysts. So basically, Customs and Border Protection and the Department of State was told, if someone comes to you wanting to work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst and they say we're in the economist category, deny. That is not included in the scope of the economist category. So first of all, let's figure out what is included in the economist category. And again, what we would do to figure that out is the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So OOH Economist, pull up that first link. First link for me, it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Click what they do. What economists do. They research economic issues. They conduct surveys, collect data, analyze data using mathematical models, statistical tools. They interpret and forecast trends. They advise businesses, governments, and individuals. They present their research. So I'm skimming through this. There is more. But that is what you want to make sure you are doing if you're coming to the US to work as an economist. So what can you not do as an economist? So, what do financial analysts do? In the government's words, what a financial analyst does is they tend to work for an institution like a bank, a hedge fund, searching for opportunities for their employer to invest money for the purpose of generating profits. So if the applicant's role is to find opportunities to invest funds for profit, that is a significant risk if they're coming to work in the economist category. Market research analysts. The way I think about this role is they are helping their US employer improve their marketing practices. So they are doing research on how they can change their marketing. Maybe it's social media, maybe it's print advertising, but they are advising their employer on how to improve their marketing, how to make it more effective, reach a target market. So these roles, it's not necessarily black and white. There may be some overlap. So what I will say is it is generally speaking, it may be okay to perform some of those tasks for financial analysts and market research analysts if it is the clear minority of your job duties. If you're only spending 5 or 10% of your time, say, doing economic research on the market, your employer's market, and making recommendations on that, that very well could be approved if the other 90% of your time you are clearly doing what economists do according to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. But you do run a risk as you have job duties that the government thinks are job duties performed by financial analysts and market research analysts. So basically make it clear that your job duties are going to be closer to the OOH economist job duties versus financial analysts and market research analysts. And it would be worth, if you're in this category, just going to the OOH, looking up what market research analysts do and financial analysts, and make it clear that that's not what you want to be doing on a TN. You do want to be doing what economists do according to the OOH. So the TN application process, we've already talked about quite a bit of this, so I think we can get through this quite quickly. Canadians can apply at a port of entry, an airport, or a land crossing. What would they provide? So when they apply, a TN applicant, generally speaking, would include, like I said before, a letter from the US employer that is on the US employer's letterhead and has an original signature from the US employer describing who the US employer is, what they do, what they sell, why they need someone in this TN occupational category, who the employee applicant is, the TN applicant, why they qualify, how they qualify for the TN, whether that's their degree or experience, whatever it is according to the regulations. So again, an accountant can have a degree or a professional license, an economist needs the degree. So that would be specified in the employer letter, as well as how much they intend to pay the person and for how long they intend to employ them. Maximum 3 years, because the TN cannot be granted for more than 3 years. Unless it's a national of Mexico applying at the consulate in Mexico, and can get 4 years. So that letter from the employer is oftentimes the key piece of a TN application. And most of the time we spend on TN applications is spent working with our client and oftentimes the employer directly to craft that employer letter on behalf of our client. So additionally, the application should include documents showing that the person qualifies based on the TN regulations. So if they're applying based on a degree, they need to have the original diploma with them. I know it sounds a little absurd, but Customs and Border Protection, as well as consulates, see a lot of fraud. So they don't tend to accept copies when it comes to TN applications. They want to see the original documents with original signatures. So make sure to bring those with you. The exception, I will say, excuse me, is skipping to the last bullet here, is if you're applying from within the US with USCIS. USCIS does not need original documents. They will accept copies, and you would have the same application packet. It would be the employer letter, it would be proof of how you qualify, as well as your passport if you're applying at a port of entry or a consulate, and a copy of your passport if you're applying through USCIS. Excuse me. So if if you are a Canadian applying at a port of entry, it is always good to contact the port of entry ahead of time just to make sure you're aware of their procedures, if there's anything in particular you need to know. And some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So you can find this on the CBP website. We also help our clients figure out strategically where would be best to apply. So nationals of Mexico, as we discussed before, cannot apply at a port of entry, must apply at a consulate. They would do that by filing the DS-160, paying the application fee, scheduling their fingerprints and photos, and then attending their appointment, their interview. And as I mentioned before, sometimes renewal applicants are eligible to mail in their documents. So that's very convenient if you qualify for that. And finally, nationals of Mexico or Canada can apply within the US through USCIS. And as I said before, you would submit copies of the same documents I described before, and the employer would file the I-129, which is the petition for a change of status to TN status. Some tips and common TN visa pitfalls. As I mentioned, it's always good to call ahead to the port of entry if you're unfamiliar with the procedures. The sometimes when you apply at a consulate or the port of entry, the government official, the officer will call the person who signed the employer letter. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does sometimes happen. So it's always good to just give your employer a heads up. I plan to be at the airport tomorrow between 3 and 5 o'clock. If you could just have your phone on you in case they call, it might be worthwhile. That's usually a good thing to do. As I mentioned, bring your diploma, official transcripts, and original signed version of the employer letter, since ports of entry and the consulate wants to see original documents. So why transcripts? I haven't mentioned transcripts yet. So one thing that is very important to keep in mind is when you see in the TN regulations, it says you can qualify based on a baccalaureate degree, on a degree generally, you do need to make sure that degree is related to the job you're coming into the US to do. So the example I like to use is, let's say you are coming to the US to work as an economist and your degree is in English. That is going to be a very difficult application to get approved. The reason is that the government wants to see that your degree or however you're qualifying is related to the job in the US. So, yeah, and you can see how there really is a spectrum. So, in a degree in English for an economist position, very risky. A degree in economics, easy, right? You clearly have the degree, check, move forward. As long as you're doing the job duties and the role is legitimate, you're very likely to be approved. But what about the middle? What about if your degree is in math or your degree is in finance, statistics, and you're applying for that economist role? In those cases, you very well could be approved, but it's good to be ready to make your argument. So transcripts can be helpful there. So if you have a degree in math, but you took a number of classes in economics, and maybe you wrote a thesis a subject or a topic related to economics. Maybe you did independent research on economics. All of those things make it clear to the government officer that in fact your degree is related to the job. Again, I'm using the example of an economist. Even if your degree is in English and you're applying for the economist role, there is a chance that could get approved if you can go into exactly what I just said. Maybe you took classes that in economics. Maybe you started with basic economics classes and built up, and Uh, in your summers, during term time, you did research, you worked in a lab, and you got credit to work in an economics lab. There are ways that you might be able to make the argument, but that being said, by and large, a degree in English is going to be very difficult to qualify for an economist role. So you do want to make sure your degree is related. And another side note, um, even though the regulations say baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, if you have a more advanced degree in the subject, that's generally fine. So if your baccalaureate degree is in English, but you then went to the London School of Economics and have a degree in a master's degree in economics, that would generally be fine. If your degree was issued by an institution outside of Canada, Mexico, or the United States, you do need to get an equivalency analysis. So basically, where a third party will look at the degree and say it's equivalent to whatever degree in the US. So even the London School of Economics, even though it's world renowned, known around the world, you still need to get that equivalency because it's located in the UK. It's not located in Canada, Mexico, or the US. But if your degree is from Canada, Mexico, or the US, you do not need an equivalency analysis. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa and requires a showing of non-immigrant intent. So what does that mean? Non-immigrant, this is a very confusing term to many people because it's just not a word we use unless you're an immigration lawyer. So basically, a non-immigrant visa is a visa that's not a green card. So a green card is an immigrant visa. What an immigrant is in immigration law is someone who plans to stay in the US permanently. So if you are applying for a TN visa, you actually cannot intend to stay in the US permanently. If the government finds out you actually want to stay in the US permanently and you're applying for a TN, you will be denied a TN. So it is a non-immigrant visa. You should be prepared to show proof that you have ties abroad. So that could be copies of your bank account from abroad, if you own property abroad, things like that. But that being said, this usually does not come up until you've renewed your TN visa several times. So if you are going on year 7, 8, 9 on your TN, you've renewed a few times, you might start getting questions about, do you actually intend to leave the US eventually, or is this a permanent thing? But otherwise, you're very likely not going to get questions about your intent to leave. All right, so that concludes our presentation. I would encourage you all, if you want it, we have a few minutes, so feel free to send in any questions you have. If we have a master's degree from Canada and a bachelor's degree from the UK, should I get the evaluation done? That depends on which degree you need. So if you qualify based on your uh, master's, so let's go back to our economist example. If you have a bachelor's degree from the UK in economics and your master's is from Canada in economics, then just use the Canadian degree. That's not a problem. You don't even need to worry about the bachelor's degree. But if it's the UK degree that's in economics and the master's from Canada is in English, and you're applying as an economist, you need to get the equivalency because you're applying based on that UK degree. So it really depends on which degree you're needing for the application. Can someone move from TN to H1B? Yes, you can. That is actually one of the very common ways to pursue a green card, is to move from a TN to an H1B, and while in H1B, filing a green card application. Because the H1B, even though it's a non-immigrant visa, it is what's called dual intent. So you're able to intend to stay in the US permanently if you're on an H1B. So it can be a very good bridge, so to speak, to a green card. You can definitely do that. All right, that concludes all of the questions. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the great questions. I do encourage you, keep an eye out for For the email we will send you that has links to our YouTube channel, our TN guide, as well as where you can schedule a consultation if you have questions about your circumstances. One final question: is the management consulting category the best option for a banking professional? Does an offer letter from a large bank help the case versus a small one? Not really. So the management consulting category, it's going to depend on your job duties. A banking professional in risk management, we would have to look at the job duties and really talk about the circumstances there. So it really comes down to the specific circumstances. So I'd encourage you to schedule a consultation to discuss that one further. But everyone, thank you so much for taking the time. We look forward to seeing you on future presentations, and stay healthy and well in the meantime. Thank you.